let me say a few words about this project and this cooperation, as we're very proud of it and excited about today's release. The project started almost 2 years ago when Rukmini approached us and asked if we wanted to become the academic partners of the Times in storing and making available to the public the roughly 1,500 internal ISIS files she collected while embedded with the Iraqi army. We enthusiastically accepted, as we thought it was not just an amazing research opportunity, but also something that fulfills an academic institution's mandate to document and preserve history. Rukmini will speak right after me and provide more details about her work in Iraq and about the importance of using primary sources to better understand groups like ISIS. So I won't get that much into it, but let me briefly explain what we have done over the last 2 years since we received the files. From the very beginning, the guiding idea has been that of making the documents available to everybody, while at the same time adhering to the highest ethical and academic standards. In that vein, the process started with getting the documents professionally digitized and translated. Understanding the importance of providing high quality and culturally competent translation, we hired 2 experienced translators, both natives of Iraq. And each document that was translated was then checked by at least 2 additional individuals. At the same time, we partnered with GW's Library and Academic Innovation to build an open, searchable website as a public repository. The website is now officially live, I'm very happy to say. So I urge you to go to isisfiles.gwu.edu. Let me repeat that, isisfiles.gwu.edu, and browse it. This is still to some degree work in progress, and we have just uploaded the first batch of files. Many more will be uploaded in the following months. But allow me to thank the entire team of the library for their hard work on this. Let me in particular acknowledge Dean Geneva Henry, Hannah Summers, Robin Delaloy, Elizabeth Oraksa, Matthew Mihalik, Quinn Barron, Dan Kirchner, Amal Cavender for their phenomenal contribution. As we worked on these technical aspects of the project, we also devoted substantial attention to its many ethical aspects. The ethical, legal, and security implications involved in a project like this are plentiful. Balancing the need to inform the public with that of protecting the security of individuals mentioned in the documents is a particularly challenging task. So over the last 2 years, we conducted extensive research on the ethics and best practices of archiving and publishing sensitive documents. We organized workshops in 3 different countries and contacted some 300 stakeholders and potential users to pick their brains about ethical concerns and use of the files. A document that details our approach to these important matters is now posted on the project's website. The last piece of this complicated puzzle is the analysis. The ISIS files provide a unique snapshot over some aspects of how the group fought some issues and functioned in some fields. But the ISIS files do not hold all the secrets to understanding every aspect of the Islamic State. Far from it. They are a snapshot which acquires significantly increased value only when properly analyzed and contextualized. For this very reason, the Program on Extremism has decided to accompany the release of the documents with analytical projects. Over the next year, we will periodically release batches of the ISIS files documents in their original in Arabic and an English translation that deal with a specific subject: redistribution of land, policing, economic administration, military tactics, and so on. The release of the documents will coincide with the publication of a study that will focus on the same topic. The studies will be authored by some of the best experts in the field, and we have the privilege of having some of them speaking today as we release their reports. Before turning it to Rukmini, who'll give sort of a keynote to today's event, allow me to take another second to thank the team at the Program on Extremism for all their work on this project. This has been a massive endeavor, and every team member has contributed to it. I would like to thank our ISIS Files Fellows who are here today: Kolbanzel, Ayman Tamimi, and Omar Mohammed. But let me also give a special acknowledgement to two team members of the Program on Extremism team who have spearheaded this project. Devorah Margolin, who as a project manager, has dealt magnificently with the countless aspects of the project, and Haroro Ingram, who has been masterfully supervising all the analytical components. The program today is very busy. We only have a bit more than an hour and almost 10 speakers, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll ask everybody to be quick and basically leave their comments to some 5 minutes, and then we'll try magically to even have a short Q&A at the end, if that is possible. So without further ado, let me turn it to Rukmini Kalimaki, who needs no introduction. And just what I want to say is thank you again for the opportunity to work with you in the New York Times on this project. Rukmini? You have to unmute you have to be unmuted or unmute yourself.
There you go, thanks. Lorenzo, thank you so much. Today is nothing short, but a dream come true for me. The second that I found the first large batch of documents in Iraq in 2016, the issue for me was, first, I felt enormous excitement at having found this discovery, which was going to help my own understanding of the terror group. But the second dimension of it was, how could we make this valuable trove available not just to journalists at the New York Times, not just to a couple of hand-picked researchers, but how could we make it available to the public at large? And by at large, I mean not just the American public, but also people in the Middle East, and specifically in Iraq and Syria, who were victimized by this group. And today marks the fulfillment of that. So Lorenzo, Devorah, the library team, I am really so grateful to you, and I'm so grateful also to the New York Times for making this happen. I began covering terrorism in 2013. A year earlier, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda had taken over the northern half of Mali. I was new to the beat. I'd never covered Al-Qaeda or its affiliates before. And so I covered that group much like any other reporter covers it. Namely, I covered it through the sources that I could reach by phone. Mostly those were diplomats working in Western embassies in the region, as well as sources in Washington, at the Pentagon, at the State Department. Based on what those sources told me, I wrote stories and I created a worldview of what this terror group was that I later learned was almost entirely inaccurate as a result of the documents that I discovered from the group on the ground when the group was finally kicked out. In 2013, a French army unit went into northern Mali to help flush out the jihadists. I was among the journalists that followed behind them, and I reached the city of Timbuktu just after it had been liberated. To my surprise, in the buildings that this Al-Qaeda group had occupied, I found thousands of pages of documents that they had left behind. They had literally left them in the drawers of the desks behind which they had sat, under the beds where they had slept, in the cupboards, and in overturned cabinets and shelves. I gathered them and I began working with a group of translators to translate them. And the first thing that became apparent in those documents was that the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Mali was taking direct orders from Al-Qaeda's senior leadership in the Gulf. For example, we found letters from a man called Nasser al-Wahishi, who has since been killed in a drone strike, who was then considered the general manager of Al-Qaeda, and who was giving detailed instructions to the guys in Mali about how to run the territory that they had controlled. At that point in time, the Pentagon and officials in Washington were telling reporters like me that the group in Mali had no real connection to Al-Qaeda, that it had only taken the Al-Qaeda name opportunistically. I mentioned this incident just to square the point and to stress the idea that the war on terror has become a very politicized entity. Officials in Washington and beyond are always trying to project a positive narrative about their success against this group, including saying things like this group in Mali had no real affiliation to Al-Qaeda. It's for that reason that I think seeking out the group's internal records is essential. And by internal records, I mean records that were never meant for publication. This is very different from collecting the group's propaganda online. These are internal memos, strategy documents, letters between commanders, diaries of ISIS fighters. And these records are primary sources that give a lens into what the group thinks about itself. Starting in 2016, I began doing the same work in Iraq and Syria as I had done in Mali, and embedding always with the Iraqi military with different units of their armed forces. I began going into the areas that had just been liberated from ISIS. And starting in December of 2016, I began finding large batches of documents. We found in total 15,000 pages of internal records, not 1,500, 15,000 pages of internal records over 5 separate trips spanning months on the ground. As soon as I came back to the New York Times newsroom, it became clear that we would do our own story on these documents, maybe a couple of stories. But there was no appetite at a news organization to essentially act as an archivist and to spend the large sums of money that it would take to get all of these documents translated. And so we began looking for an academic partner. I am so grateful that we met Lorenzo Bedino and Seamus Hughes, that we met Devora, and that the library stepped in and helped us to fulfill this goal. And I wanted to end by just putting out a call to fellow journalists, to fellow reporters. Many of us have been embedded on these front lines, and it just so happens that because of the nature of our work, we're often in these buildings right after they've been liberated. That means that we are often in a position to find these documents, and sometimes we find them and they just end up back in our attic. I would like to invite fellow journalists to contribute their respective troves to the project. You will be given credit. This will not be something that where your name is forgotten. But I would like this to become a collective project where all of us, as we find these precious records, are able to gather them and bring them to GW so that others can also study them. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you very much. And I think you made it very clear the case and for the spirit of this project. Appreciate it. Let me very quickly turn it to one of the core team members who has been spearheading the analysis from our end, and that's Program on Extremism Senior Fellow Haroro Ingram. Haroro?
Right, well, good morning, and I intend to keep my remarks pretty brief today, but I do want to begin with a quick round of acknowledgements and thanks. First to Rukmini. Without her efforts, we literally wouldn't have the primary sources that will be released over the coming months. And so for that, we're really appreciative. Thanks also to Lorenzo, who brought this project together and has been a crucial driving force for the kind of resource, oversight and direction that makes a project like this possible. Thanks to the GW Library for their expertise that has been vital for the online repository and website, which I encourage you all to check out today. And of course, our Iraqi colleagues who have been vital partners throughout this process. And we're really looking forward to strengthening those collaborations in the months ahead and beyond. And finally, of course, a big thank you to Devora, who has managed this project and ensured that we got to launch day. Look, so much of what you will hear about today is due to her tireless work. So I think we all, very, very thankful for her efforts, and myself in particular. Look, being lucky enough to be part of this project, one can't help but feel a great sense of responsibility for ensuring that we do our best to get this right, to ensure that we make an important collection of primary source materials not just available, but accessible and useful for a range of different audiences, to ensure that the body of knowledge and research, but also the field of practice can expand. Now, this is important, first and foremost, for those communities that lived under ISIS occupation. I've worked with such communities in places like Iraq, Syria, and the Philippines, but you don't have to have had those firsthand experiences to appreciate that each of these primary sources offers insights into a human tragedy. And I encourage everyone that engages with these sources to keep that at the forefront of their minds, to never lose sight of that context, those people, and a major reason why most, if not all of us, got into this field, to contribute to understanding, confronting, and preventing these threats. We also saw this as an important opportunity to help to contribute primary source materials that are so essential for moving scholarly research and the field of practice forward. We were conscious of trying to ensure that we did everything reasonably possible to help shape the way that not only researchers and practitioners, but students and the general public engage with these primary sources. On this note, a useful way to approach the repository, as Lorenzo has hinted to, is to think of it as a cross-sectional snapshot of Islamic State specific to a particular time and location. While some documents are dated as early as 2014 and others as late as 2017, the bulk of this collection is from 2015 to 2016 and is specific to Nineveh Province, but mostly Mosul and its surrounds. Now, in this regard alone, the collection has great historical and analytical value, also offering important insights for how to prevent and counter the group. But the Islamic State movement has a decades-long history with a lineage that stretches back in the 1990s and forward to the present day. So we saw it as our responsibility as analysts, as researchers, to ensure that we provided that broader strategic and historical context, as well as outline, again, the potential implications for practitioners via accompanying research products. This is why each tranche of primary source materials is accompanied by analysis written by some of the leading researchers in this field. It is an approach that is designed to help those who are engaging with documents in this repository, some for the first time, to do so appropriately, informed by how those particular sources that reflect realities at a particular time and a particular place fit into the broader phenomenon of the Islamic State movement. Over the coming months, we will be releasing tranches of sources by theme, accompanied by about 11 major publications. The first two, Ideology and Real Estate, are out today and will be followed by papers on judiciary and grievances, Dawah, military, Islamic police, education, agriculture, health, women, zakat, and an overarching final report that will be released early next year. A series of webinars featuring the authors and other guests will be rolled out with these publications too. Now, Devorah and I have written a short overview of the files in a paper titled Inside the Islamic State in Mosul, a snapshot of the logic and banality of evil, where we outline the limitations of the collection for scholars, its historical context, and the project's research agenda in a lot more detail. So we hope you get a chance to have a look at that too. So thank you again.
Thank you, Ara. Thank you very much. Very quickly, let me turn it to the indispensable Devorah, also senior fellow of the program.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And thank you to all of our panels here today. I know this is a little bit repetitive, but again, thank you to our translators and to our ISIS Files fellows who've been working on this project for over a year, and to the GW Library and Academic Innovations team. In particular, I'd like to thank Dan Kirchner and Amal Cavendar, who worked tirelessly to make sure that this website is perfect. I'd also like to thank the research teams who are working to contextualize these files. And over the next year, we do look forward to publishing their analysis. Working on this project, I've gotten to read the files multiple times and really work with these teams who are helping to place them within the time and place they were collected and within the larger field. These ISIS files show the interconnectedness between the Islamic State departments and the extensive bureaucracy administered by the Islamic State. As we talk about in our report, many of these documents detail the higher up levels of the administration, such as a document found in real estate that details 28 pages of the real estate department, but also they talk about the day-to-day of those that live under the Islamic State. In addition to helping grow the interdisciplinary research on the Islamic State and governance, this collection offers a human perspective, with each file detailing the lives that of those that lived under the Islamic State's occupation. This personalized view often juxtaposes with the top-down strategic level analysis of the movement that dominates our field. And with that, I'm delighted to share with you the ISIS Files website. So please do bear with me for 5 seconds as I share my screen. As you come onto the ISIS Files website, you are able to learn more about the genesis of our project, as well as the featured works that will be listed here. As mentioned, this is an iterative project, and so over time, we'll be uploading more work. And so if you are a returning user, I highly recommend you check out our recently uploaded section. At the bottom of the website, you'll be able to link to the GW Library and Academic Innovation, the Program on Extremism, and the New York Times. I also highly encourage all of our users to check out our terms of use, privacy notice, copyright, accessibility, as well as how to contact us if needed. You can learn more about the program on the project overview, the ethical framework, and the translation glossary. We have a full tab labeled to analysis, and learn more about our themes. As mentioned, we've already published documents related to real estate and taxation, ideology, as well as several miscellaneous files. We have a lot of search tools involved in this project, so as you come in, you can always find the contextual analysis of the theme at the top of the collection, and more information and all the files linked to it below. You can also limit your search by subject or type or language, and when you're in the file, you'll be able to find the digitized Arabic version, including metadata, and if you scroll down, you can find the accompanying English translation. I highly encourage you to also use the search tool at the top. And with that, I will hand it back to Lorenzo, and I encourage you all to explore our ISIS Files website.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you very much. As we said, we really want to provide these documents in a way that is as authentic as possible, but we really feel strongly about accompanying them with analysis that contextualizes them. That's why today we have 3 of the first contributors to the ISIS Files in terms of their analysis. So let me go to the first one, who does not really need an introduction, is the monstrous Ayman Tamimi, who's a fellow at the Center for Global Policy, but also a fellow with us at the program. Ayman, your take on the files you looked at.
Yes, hello, thank you. It's a pleasure to be speaking today. I think actually that doing real estate and taxation as the theme of my paper was particularly appropriate one. Why? Because I'd worked in doing Islamic State documents and analysis of them for some time. I'd started my own archive of them back all the way at the beginning of 2015. And of course, our understanding has evolved over time. And I actually initially wrote an analysis of what we could glean about Islamic State administration from what was really then back in summer 2015, only a small collection of only around over 100 documents or so. Of course, my collections and what we're adding, it adds massively to the quantity of internal files we have available. But from what was the limited data we had at the time, we didn't really know about an Islamic State real estate management department and land taxation. And actually, it was also notable that when Rukmini mentioned, for example, this issue of the difference between Islamic State propaganda, what it broadcasts to the external world, and things that are only meant for internal use and publication. It was significant in terms of researching real estate as part of this paper, that in 2016, when the Islamic State advertised its own structure of the caliphate according to its propaganda, it didn't mention the real estate department as one of its departments of administration. It listed many others, which are more familiar to the outside world, like Hisba and Dawah and the court system and so on and so forth. But the real estate wasn't mentioned. Now, whether it was because of an oversight or was it because it's a sensitive topic to deal with, you can't be sure of that. But what we do have here from the documents that came with this collection, and also through comparing with other things I'd collected over the years, both which I've already published online, and also some internal files of my own that I've included with this paper that I've done for GW. We had a systematic overview of how the real estate department was working under the Islamic State, and one, I think, key findings that we found from it were that confiscation of existing real estate was, of course, the key behind how Islamic State acquired this real estate in the first place, and the particular categories of people they confiscated from. I mean, in particular, original disbelievers, as one might put it, like Christians and Yazidis, for example, and especially Christians who fled Islamic State territory and didn't want to live under Islamic State rule. Their property became Islamic State real estate. The other category, of course, is so-called apostates. And so, for example, they had applied this designation to the Iraqi government, Syrian government, Libyan government properties that they took, and also from people who'd been affiliated with, say, the Iraqi security forces and fled Islamic State territory and didn't want to come back and repent. And also, of course, Shia Muslims who are designated apostates by the Islamic State as well. Their property was all liable to confiscation. And as Deborah had mentioned, of course, in her remarks about coordination between different Islamic State bureaucratic departments, the real estate department the Islamic State set up, it wasn't acting on its own, but it coordinated, for example, with the judiciary department, the war spoils department regarding confiscations and issuing of confiscation orders by the judiciary and management of the real estate. And of course, other departments as well, like agriculture, real estate, it also includes land, not just houses. And so, say in agricultural contracts managed by the agricultural department would involve coordination with the real estate department as well. So confiscation is key mechanism, the coordination with other departments. And then also I discussed within the paper as well the how that real estate was used. And so I think I dealt with some possibly popular misconceptions about how property was managed. So, for example, when we deal with the issue of Islamic State fighters and members, the properties generally that the Islamic State granted, as we find from the documents, they weren't given to them as personal private possessions, but they were actually rented out, considered to be rented out to them. Whether or not they had discounts or exemption from rent was another matter that's also discussed within the paper. And finally, just to round it off, of course, the key issue was renting out of property to the wider population. And that, of course, I think is what became to be considered land tax for the Islamic State, part of the official title of the bureaucratic Department of Real Estate and Land Tax. And so that was found to be a key source of revenue for the Islamic State during its time of territorial control. But of course, that could only last as long as the Islamic State controlled territory. And of course, today they don't hold territory. So there's nothing to be made of real estate and renting out. So I'll round off there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayman. That's very good. Thank you. Thank you for staying within the time. I know I'm being very strict about it and I hate it, but thank you, appreciate it. Let me quickly turn it to the second contributor of a report that we're publishing today. Also a fellow with the program, but also a fellow at the Hoover Institution, Cole Bunzel.
Hi, good morning, Lorenzo and everyone. Thanks for having me, and I will try to be super brief, even though sometimes explaining these issues isn't always easy to short amount of time. So my paper and my study was focused on the ideology of the Islamic State, and particularly the ideological rift within the group that pertains to the doctrine of takfir, or which is often translated as excommunication and means to declare someone an unbeliever. In groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, what this is really referring to is declaring fellow Muslims to be unbelievers on the grounds that they have some theological deficiency. So I looked at the files pertaining to ideology, which are really scattered across the caliphate. We don't have a core corpus of files from, say, the main scholarly outfit of the group, something called the Office of Research and Studies, but we do have a number of files that they produced found among a number of places. So one of those places is something called the Martyrdom Seekers Brigade, Katibat al-Istishhadiyin, which was training fighters to engage in suicide operations. And you see there a number of ideological texts. One of these, a lot of these, I should mention, are already online. That is the nature of propaganda, but some of them were not intended to be online. Some of them were intended only to be used in these training camps. So one of them is a primer on Tawheed, called Muqarrar fi Tawheed, or a primer on Tawheed. Tawheed being the doctrine of God's oneness. And this is a set of texts that is essentially a number of Wahhabi texts. So Wahhabism is the puritanical Islamic movement in Sunni Islam that comes out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century and has left a deep influence on groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So it's basically a commentary on a number of these Wahhabi texts. Another is an additional commentary on Wahhabi texts by somebody named Abu Muhammad al-Azdi. This is something that's definitely not online. 150-page commentary by a man who was the deputy leader of the main scholarly outfit, the Office of Research and Studies. So I looked at these documents to look at how they approach the doctrine of takfir, because the doctrine of takfir became a matter of dispute in the Islamic State as early as 2014, but it really blew up in 2017, 2018 into a really big rift in the group, leading to a number of the scholars to dissociate from the group and things like that. And so you can see that they're basically taking a very restrained approach to takfir. I mean, relatively speaking, like in Islam, no, this is not a restrained approach to takfir. But in the world of jihadi Salafism, this is a rather restrained approach. So they're saying that the doctrine of takfir, which in Wahhabism requires one to pronounce takfir or to excommunicate those who refuse or fail to pronounce takfir on fellow Muslim, on those perceived to be polytheists or unbelievers, that those people have to be pronounced takfir upon. So the way that this is definitely usually couched is the principle of whoso does not declare, whoso does not pronounce takfir on an unbeliever is himself an unbeliever. And the scholars were warning in the training camps and in their materials that this could lead to a spiral of takfir, where people are just pronouncing takfir ad infinitum on fellow Muslims in the group. And there was indeed a group within, or a faction of people in the Islamic State who did hold to this spiraling takfir concept. So one of the problems within the group was what to do with, say, the leader of Al-Qaeda, which some people in the group believed that he was an unbeliever. You know, if you believe he's an unbeliever, then somebody who doesn't pronounce him to be an unbeliever, you have to make takfir of that person too. So you can see how it escalates. So the scholars were playing down the concept of takfir and saying that principle of having to pronounce takfir on those who refuse to pronounce takfir on unbelievers is not to really be applied to specific individuals. And you also see this in the notebooks that the training camp attendees were taking. I found this interesting because you'd think that people who were being groomed for suicide operations would be learning more about the pleasures of paradise than the strictures of Wahhabi theology, but that is not the case as far as I could tell. The last thing I'll mention is there are a number of other texts that in the ISIS files that illustrate divisions in the group. A lot of them are very vague. So pronouncements in letters urging people not to reproach one another, not to basically accuse each other of offenses without verifying first. So we get a sense of an organization. This is really the snapshot 2015, 2016, that had divisions and ideological divisions in particular. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Cole. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let me move on to our next speaker, who is Omar Mohammed. One thing that I'm not sure we mentioned is that the vast majority of the files in the collection come from the Nineveh province, and in particular from the Mosul area, from Mosul and a few towns around Mosul. So as we talked a lot about contextualizing the files, understanding the local environment, obviously partnering with scholars in Iraq has been one of our priorities from the beginning. So, and one of the scholars we had the opportunity to work with is Omar Mohammed, who needs no introduction, just in case, is the founder of Mosul Eye and now a fellow at the program of extremism. Omar.
Thank you, Lorenzo. And thanks to the program on extremism for making this possible. As a historian and as someone who documented ISIS firsthand when I lived in Mosul under their rule, I understand the importance and the value of the archives and the documents. It's not only linked to what happened in Iraq after 2014, but Iraq suffered from many historical gaps because the documents disappeared, or documents didn't exist, or the government changed the narrative. So with these documents, hopefully we'll be able to produce the real narrative about what happened in Mosul, in Iraq, and in Syria as well. My project with a program on extremism focuses on the judicial system, which is directly connected to the public, because under the judicial system and the courts works the Islamic police, and it will help us to understand the chain of the orders, who arrest the people, who report the people, and who issue the order to execute or to lead the people to prison or to release them. The first thing about these documents of the judicial system, it will help us in a very important way if we understand them with a comparative study with what they did in Syria, with what they did in Libya and in other territories. And thanks to Ayman, who provided a very important document about the judicial system in Syria and Deir ez-Zor. This will help us to understand how the courts of ISIS functioned, who were the people who were reporting, what were they reporting. It will help us to understand how the society lived. And it's also not just under ISIS, but how the society lived pre-ISIS, and how ISIS wanted to use the judicial system as an approach to gain the trust from the people. We have seen many reports on minor things, things that you might think it's not important to report it to the court, but everything was in many cases being reported. If someone has stolen something, someone suspected someone was smoking inside his house, someone was watching. There are many documents that you might think it's funny, but it might lead to execution. Someone was being reported because he was watching certain kind of films that are not allowed by ISIS, so he was arrested. Other people were reporting certain kind of what ISIS called it the crimes, is that this person was running from the mosque during the prayer time, etc. But the importance of these documents and how we can connect them to the Islamic police documents is that it will help to understand how ISIS prosecuted communities, and it will help in the prosecution of ISIS. When you bring ISIS to justice, the people will have evidence to show to the courts that our sons or people were executed by ISIS. So it's not just setting up a historical approach to understand these documents, but they are connected directly to the future of the people and those who were victimized by ISIS. The second, and also it's important part of these documents, is we know that the jihadist evolution in Iraq, the jihadists since 2004, especially not 2003, they had their own courts, but these courts were limited to their internal issues. So when you look at the documents of ISIS in the judicial system, you would find some similarities between the former courts of the jihadists and how it also evolved and developed to lead to establishing these courts, Islamic police. I remember on June 13, which is like just 4 days of ISIS occupying Mosul, June 13, 2014, we saw all the Islamic police stations were established. Seems like everything was ready at that time for ISIS. So this is what we are trying to do at this program. It's very important also to the people of Mosul. the city that have suffered and lived under this brutality of ISIS. It's important to all the researchers, it's important to the history, it's important to protect the future of the people, but as I always say, we should never forget history. History should be told, no matter how it was happened, but it should be told because we need to avoid same problems from happening again. That's why I think it's very important, as Lorenzo mentioned, he is in this program is trying to bring more Iraqis to understand the local context of these documents, but I hope that the program will be larger than just Iraq, that will go more beyond Iraq in order to establish, as we have been discussing many times, that terrorism studies needs to be a well-established knowledge, and it needs to be an academic field that brings more knowledge to researchers, students, and future scholars. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I think, yes, indeed, from the beginning, there's been an idea of making this initial collection just a foundation for a larger collection of documents on different groups in different parts of the world. And I think we're all in agreement about the importance of primary sources to better understand the groups like ISIS and beyond. Everyone has been phenomenal in sticking to the 5 minutes that I assigned, almost too good. We do have concluding remarks from 2 people, and I very much look forward to that. But we also at this point have a few minutes for questions. So we already have a couple, and I'm sure the moment I say this, more will come. So let me ask to everybody on the panel, what is that surprised you the most about ISIS by working on these documents? Did you find out new things, things that sort of went against the grain? Anybody? You're supposed to say yes.
I'll start. Okay. I think actually it was useful to me because I've been working on this for a while. It was less about surprises, more as trying to see how it corroborated or differed with what was previously understood. So certainly the contrast between the propaganda and the internal thing is one issue. Actually, in terms of the specific things I looked at, I think it was the getting more clarification on how Islamic State dealt with real estate and renting it, and the status when it came to, say, giving these properties to fighters. That, contrary to the idea that it was, granting as general policy as granting as private personal possessions of these fighters and members, it was actually going to be rented out to them. So that was the main, I think that was the main thing that struck me in looking at the particular set of files I had.
I think for me, just to jump in as well, I mean, I agree with Ayman. I think a lot of what we were looking at, we kind of had an idea of before, but it really knocked those issues home. But I think the one thing that really surprised me was the meticulous record, specifically, looking in the agricultural department, where the Islamic State detailed who they took the land from and who they gave the land to. And that record keeping is extremely important. And it's something that you kind of think maybe they would have been smarter enough not to document it in such a meticulous way, but they did. And that was really interesting. The other thing that I found fascinating was the interconnectedness between the departments. So we could see a dispute beginning in the real estate department, being handed over to the Islamic police, and then ending up in judiciary and grievances to be resolved. I thought that really showed the bureaucracy and the organizational aspects of the organization.
I'll mention something. I mean, a lot of the ideological stuff isn't, a lot of it, I agree with Ayman, there's a lot of clarification, things that, I didn't quite understand. I mean, things we could see how the scholars in the group wants to portray things, and then you can see it better on the ground level. And it's not necessarily surprising so much as clarifying. Say, oh, okay, the scholars really did decide what was being taught in the training camps, and people did take notes on exactly what they were saying. That kind of thing is interesting. Also, one thing though that was surprising, this was mentioned by Craig Whiteside in a recent seminar that we did. He mentioned that there were Muslim scholars or religious advisors embedded at the platoon level in ISIS, which means that there's a really large number of people who are these self-styled Sharia advisors in the group, which just goes to show that they really did take religion seriously, even if they were manipulating it for their own political ends.
Perfect. Let me ask everybody also another question. I'm lumping together a few questions that basically look at the counter-narrative, counter-messaging value, potential value of the documents. Do you see, maybe I'm asking this to Haroro, who's done a lot of work on this, do you see any value in studying these documents from a counter-narrative point of view? Again, you're supposed to say yes, but
well, yeah, well, of course, but I mean, I do think that there is immense value, and in fact, for all the reasons which Ayman, Dev, and Cole have touched upon in their response to the previous answer, which was what you get with the ISIS files is not just the strategic high-level kind of proclamations and guidance, but you get an insight into what daily life was like. Both for the people under ISIS occupation, but also, I guess, from within the organization itself. I think there is that for those who kind of work as practitioners, and particularly in trying to push back against this group, it is these tensions between what the group says and what it actually does that are really important. The way that it projects itself through its propaganda and what it actually looks like on the ground. And I think that on that basis, it is really essential that scholars, but also practitioners, dive into these sources, that they go into other primary source collections that are available out there. That they read, for example, Omar's posts with writing as Mosulai to kind of get an insight into those potential contradictions, those opportunities to leverage where the group has frankly lied, when it's been brutal, when it's actually contradicted its own kind of proclamations, and those opportunities are there.
Okay, there's two more questions. One, I would like Dev to address it very quickly. We have a question about redactions, and of course, it's a very complex topic, but if you can briefly explain sort of the guiding principles in the redaction process for security and ethical reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've gone a bit more in depth onto this on the website, and I extremely encourage everybody to check this out. But our main driving principle was do no harm. And we did that by removing all personal identifiable information of all individuals. And so you can look onto the website and notice when you click on a document, these documents have been redacted of personal identifiable information. If somebody is using a kunya, we left them as Abu initial, and we can discuss a bit about the process. The only case you'll find information about a full name is when somebody was at the emir level, or somebody who was known to be deceased. And we did a meticulous work to make sure that we really protected the information of all of those involved in the project, because this project isn't about the names, it's about understanding the bureaucracy and understanding the organization. And we wanted to make sure that we could convey this in an open and public manner to as many people as possible.
Perfect, thank you, Dev. And again, we have a lot of that information on the website. And as I said, we worked on this for a couple of years to really try to understand how to do it right. There's a very legitimate question about the future. We talked a lot about the past, what we can learn from the documents, but a lot of people that are tuning in now are asking about what's going to happen with ISIS in the months, years to come, for what we can predict. And I think I would like to start with Rukmini, and just very briefly for collecting your thoughts about future of ISIS, where do you see the group going locally, globally. I'll leave it to you, and then I would like very quickly from everybody 20 seconds to each, the future of ISIS. Easy. You're muted.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Hi, everyone. I think the public at large is used to thinking of ISIS as a group that burst on the scene in 2014. And I think that that's a mistake. It's a conceptual mistake because, as we know, this is a group that has much deeper roots. And I think that a more appropriate time frame to look at as the origin of the current phenomenon of ISIS is 2010, 2011. And what it feels like we are seeing now is not a return to 2014 levels of ISIS, not a return to 2013 or even 2012 levels, but I believe that we are seeing a return to the insurgency as it operated in 2010 and 2011, which is, of course, a disturbing trend. We know that that moment in time coincided with the withdrawal of American troops. We are seeing a similar dynamic now. We're seeing an administration in Washington that is turning its eyes away from that conflict as a result of fatigue and of other priorities. And so I think in Iraq and Syria, you're seeing the beginning of a new resurgence with a difference. In 2010 and 2011, the ISIS that existed then did not have the international apparatus that it has now. Just in the Al-Hol camp, the refugee camp that I have visited on multiple occasions, you have people from quite literally several dozen nationalities. That means that in each of those countries, they had some sort of nexus, some sort of ability to become interested in ISIS, to learn from each other, and then to take the enormous leap of traveling to this war zone in order to join the movement. Just last year, I spent a good amount of time in Tajikistan working on an ISIS attack that killed 4 Western bicyclists, including 2 Americans. And I got the only interview with the leader of that ISIS cell, a Tajik man, who explained to me that he had joined ISIS in 2018 and traveled to Iraq and Syria. He was actually in Tel Afar, one of the cities whose fall and liberation I was able to cover. That's a very late time frame to be joining ISIS. You know, most of the foreign fighters we think about were joining 2014, 2015, 2016. This is a guy who joins almost at the end. To me, it spoke to the continued interest that this group poses. In addition, you now have affiliates all over the world. Just before the lockdown, I was on my way to Uganda to cover the Central African affiliate, which has grown enormously in recent months. So I think that you have both a metastasizing of ISIS, you have a pollinization around the world with more and more foreigners being involved, and you have the beginning of a new insurgency at the same time that the West is taking its eyes off the ball.
Perfect. Omar, if Rukmini gave us sort of a global prediction, how do you see things more locally in the Mosul area or in Iraq more broadly?
The situation is it's, to be honest, it's very difficult to answer this question. Is what's the future of terrorism is connected to many factors, some local factors, some global factors, but on the local ones, it's directly connected to, for example, to the political situation in Iraq. But the problem that we didn't understand years ago about jihadism and about terrorism, and you can find this in research being published, is that they thought that the problem of jihadism is only related to economical issues, social issues, political issues, but the reality, it's not actually. It's much more beyond this. Those terrorists, and I have seen many of them who have been transformed completely from normal people into criminals who believe in the ability of executing everyone else in order for their ideology to survive. They are believers in their ideology, and we have also the issues of the Islamic text itself. So hopefully with these documents, we can expose ISIS much more to the public, to the people who were victimized by ISIS, but also to potential supporters of terrorism or ISIS in the future, that there is a manipulation of your religious text, and ISIS was very clever in manipulating these texts, that the people weren't aware and weren't educated enough to understand what ISIS was trying to do. So it's important to expose more and more through the research, relying on ISIS internal documents in order to create a better understanding. I hope that with these kind of similar projects like this can also address the local communities, involving more research on the ideology, not just on how ISIS functioned as a military, etc., but also on how the ideology of ISIS worked. Because if we look at ISIS, all of these branches and what they call it Diwans, the Diwan al-Hisba, etc., all of them were based on one thing, that is the ideology itself. Without the ideology, ISIS wouldn't have been able to recruit thousands of people.
Great, thank you. Cole, future of ISIS.
I think that's a big question, and I think the general attitude or mood that most of us are expressing is one of resignation at a future in which Sunni jihadism continues to plague the state of Iraq, at a time when the influence of Iran has a correspondingly negative effect. So I'm not particularly optimistic. I think that the group, as Rukmini said, does have an international appeal that it didn't have before. So it's not, I think it's on people's radar more than it was back then. So I hope that that can lead to more proactive efforts to stop the group from, say, seizing territory. But it's yet to be seen what the group intends to accomplish beyond the insurgent activity, because it's gone through a period of trying to control territory and it's seen how that ends. So if it wants to repeat history, I suppose it can do that. But for what end? I think it has to be asked. I wonder if the group is thinking about other ways, perhaps a more prolonged insurgency, something like that, not holding territory to the degree that it was.
Perfect. Last but not least, before we move to the final remarks, Ayman, your 2 cents.
My 2 cents largely coincide with what Cole Benzel has said about IS, Islamic State, being in this insurgency state. On the other hand, from their own discourse, they do seem to believe that eventually they could just break things down in the various places they're fighting and then achieve that what they call temkeen, or enabling, that enables them to control territory, implement the law of God, and implement hudud punishments. It's almost as though the experience they talk of is that from 2014, something to strive for again, and the collapse wasn't their own fault, and I regret nothing approach. Yeah, I see what we have from the files as being, say, a historical snapshot from unique historical circumstances that came together. Whether it would be replicated again within our own lifetimes is I think unlikely. But yeah, other than that, Islamic State continues to be is now this global problem in many different parts of the world, as this persistent insurgency, and just doesn't seem to go away, unfortunately.
Perfect, Ayman. Thank you very much. Let me move to the concluding part of today's event, and let me move to Safa Yassin. Let me say, from the very beginning, we tried to coordinate with the Iraqi government and with the Iraqi embassy in Washington, D.C. in particular. And we definitely found in Ambassador Yassin somebody that helped us, guided us, and understood what we were trying to do. He couldn't be with us today, but we've also had the opportunity to have Safa Yassin, who works at the embassy, and is, if I'm not mistaken, from Mosul originally, to give some remarks about the Iraqi perspective on ISIS, on the project, and more broadly. So Safa, thank you very much. Floor is yours. Sound.
Oh,
Sound. You're on.
okay. Thanks very much, Lorenzo, for giving me the space to express the point of view of the Iraqi government on the ISIS files. These files are part of Iraq's patrimony, and needless to say that the argument provided by the New York Times in that regard does not justify the process by which these files were snatched from a site that was liberated by Iraqi blood and sweat. This is the first point I would like to emphasize on. The Iraqi government welcomed the cooperation between the New York Times and the GW program on extremism, such a partnership that would help unravel the organizational structure and logistical side of the terrorist regime. We're also delighted that the University of Mosul has been partnered in this effort. Yet, this is a big yet. The major concern that we always expressed is that and I think Devorah talked about this, she dealt with this earlier. The major concern is that the dissemination of the names of individuals and their specifics might lead to personal retaliatory measures against those mentioned. And they're not necessarily ISIS recruits. And also against their families. The names of we believe that the names of the individuals and their specifics should only be shared with the judicial authorities. This is a grave concern that should be dealt with, and a step of, I would say, of paramount importance that should be taken care of. Thank you very much.
Perfect. And thank you very much. And let me reassure you, and this is something that Devorah mentioned earlier, we have embarked on a process where basically all the personally identifiable information has been redacted. So that means not just the names, that means places in many cases, that means all, for example, date of births, even if in some cases just initial date of births were given, we took out that information. It was a 2-year process in which we consulted, as I said in my initial remarks, and 300 people who with knowledge in how to do things. We talked to people that have done similar efforts in the past, and we're really taking a very cautious approach when it comes to this. The idea is not to share names, is to share actions, is to make people understand how the Islamic State operated, fully aware that none of the information that comes out of the file should in any way jeopardize the security of any individual, even if those individuals were members of ISIS itself. Justice should not come from the ISIS files or information that comes from it, if not through the proper channels. So let me reassure you and everybody else that this has been abundantly taken care of. And we really appreciate the cooperation of the Iraqi embassy, the Iraqi government, and the University of Mosul, which you mentioned. So I appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Doris.
Let me move on for the final concluding remarks from our institutional partners within GW, the library, which has wonderfully helped us in building the website and taking care of the many technical aspects of the project. So the floor for the concluding remarks has to go, rightfully so, to Dean Geneva Henry, Dean of the Library. Geneva.
Okay, thank you, Lorenzo. It's such a pleasure to be here finally at the launch of the ISIS Files project. First and foremost, I want to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who was bold and believed in us and sponsored us with a planning grant to develop a framework for ethical access to sensitive archives. The issues we've talked about today, and certainly the concerns that Safa Yassin has raised, are very real. And they are something that we have grappled with from the very start, from the day, Lorenzo, that you walked into my office and told me about this. It was, where is Mosul in all of this? So I think, we built that relationship with the University of Mosul, and Lorenzo, you did so much work to reach out to the Iraqi embassy. And I think, you know, building this type of collaboration and being sensitive to the need to treat these ethically. Our world consists of many cultures, but the knowledge is more easily available to all. Cultural context is everything. It's important to recognize that. It's important to understand ethics not from just our own perspective, but ethics from the perspective of citizens who are impacted by knowledge. So the reason libraries and archives exist in the first place is the preservation of the human record. This is critical. This is critical with these particular documents. This is our human record, but we have a critical responsibility to treat these with sensitivity. It's an issue with this project that we have grappled with, and we will continue to grapple with. We have not closed the book on all of this. We have documented our ethical approach. To date, we continue to learn. We continue to consult with other archives and as these issues continue to come up. In a digital world, it's so much easier to get hold of information, and that's wonderful. But ethics raise their head even more so now. Now that it's easy to get that information, we bear a responsibility to make sure that what is provided does not harm innocent individuals. So context is very important in how we work together globally in preserving human knowledge and preserving these archives. They are primary source documents, and there's a lot to learn from them, and there's a lot of interpretation that will go into them throughout history over time. So these will be analyzed by scholars for many years to come and help shape our understanding of civilization, of human life moving forward. It's been a pleasure to be able to partner with the New York Times with the program on extremism. All of the different parts of the GW community that have come together with this. And, you know, the Iraqi embassy, University of Mosul, these have been critical partnerships. This is the launch of the site. A tremendous amount of effort went into building the site, into the content, into the analysis. But it is just a launch, and there will be much more content to come. You know, as Rukmini invited at the start, you know, more contributors. We will, throughout the process, keep an eye to that critical balance with the ethics as we add more knowledge to this repository, make more knowledge available, and do so responsibly. So I do want to thank everybody who was involved in this project. I want to thank you for engaging with us in the Libraries and Academic Innovation to bring this to fruition. So thank you.
Fantastic, Geneva. Thank you very much. And we've gone 10 minutes above time. So I really appreciate the few hundred people who are still with us. And of course, thank you everybody that spoke today. Thank you to everybody who's been part of this project. And talk to you soon, because we will have more in the near future. Thank you very much. Goodbye.